You can be straight if you want to. You can be straight this very day. You can have a brand new way of living. You can have a lot to talk about.
The Straight program consisted of 5 phases that would take many months or even years to complete. And a lot of this time was spent as a newcomer on first phase, and anyone on second phase or above was called an old comer. The first phase of Straight was not a one-time step. First phase was a state of punishment, and it is what I like to call the hell of Straight, and by that I mean it was the worst place to be in the program. And even if you had been in Straight for a while already and made it up to 4th or 5th phase, you could easily get set back or started over for any number of reasons and find yourself condemned back to first phase as a newcomer all over again. And I saw that happen often when I was in Straight. As a newcomer, you were basically stripped of your rights and even your dignity. You have no freedom of movement, no freedom of speech, no freedom of association. There are so many oppressive rules governing a person in Straight anyway, but especially on first phase, that you are not free to do anything. You are basically a captive of the old comers in Straight. And that includes at the host home too, not just at the Straight building. All first phasers are held by the back of their pants by the old comers whenever they're not sitting down in group or at the host home. And this is to keep them from escaping and running away from the program, but it's also a psychological tool meant to humiliate the newcomer, which is a lot of what first phase seemed to be, a state of forced humiliation, and kids were shamed. There was no privacy allowed on first phase, and as a lot of people know, the old comer had to watch the newcomer use the bathroom, and this also took place at the host home. And at the building, with only 2 bathroom breaks a day, and being fed a steady diet of peanut butter sandwiches, I know constipation became a problem with a lot of people on first phase. And couple that with the disturbing aspect of being watched while using the bathroom, I believe a lot of people developed eating disorders as well. First phase in Straight was a lot like a nightmare that you can't wake up from. I remember how bleak it felt going to the building every morning. They would stuff the newcomers into these 2 small intake rooms, the guys in one and the girls in the other. And they would force you to sit cross-legged on the floor and motivate setting goals. And some of these newcomers would be dropped off at the building as early as 5 o'clock in the morning and would be held captive in this small intake room for 3 or 4 hours. And this was before the day really got started at Straight with group. The cramped conditions in these intake rooms and the tensions, I remember sometimes led to outbursts, and also since a lot of newcomers didn't get a fresh change of clothes for days at a time, body odors were a problem, and I can remember times when it was hard to breathe in the intake room, especially if you were unlucky enough to be at the back of the room, in the corner, sitting on the floor in the corner, and you couldn't move, so you pretty much had to suffer anything in the air that you had to breathe. I'll never forget what a relief it was when they would finally allow everybody to stand up and stretch your legs while all the newcomers grabbed each other by the belt loop and formed a a line to finally walk into the big group room to the rows of blue chairs and be able to sit in a chair after spending so much time in the cramped intake room on the floor. Of course, immediately after being sat down in the blue chairs, everybody in the group starts motivating to get called on, no matter what's being discussed, because you must constantly show that you are eager to stand up and talk about yourself and your drug problem in group. Each rap session lasted for a couple of hours or more and would begin with the staff member presenting some horrible scenario from their past where their behavior or drug use got them into some sort of trouble. And then they would have the group motivate to get called on to relate to this scenario with one of their own from their past. And I can say from experience and hearing others talk about this over the years that this led to kids inventing scenarios from their past to talk about in group in order to measure up to the kind of things that seemed to be expected of them to have done in their past according to what the other kids were talking about when they got called on in group. And I can remember a sort of anguish having to come up with a scenario and the dread of getting called on to stand up and be convincing to this scrutinizing group of people, and you were expected to emote and dramatize your past with ever-increasing levels of depravity. The thing is, for a kid to advance through the phases in straight, they would have to develop an almost Stockholm syndrome-like demeanor, and any deviation from this demeanor would make them the target of an Orwellian 2 minutes hate type session from staff and the group itself. This was especially true for kids who, for one reason or another, decided to rebel against the program and became what was known as a misbehavior. And these kids generally just wanted to be left alone, but since that wasn't allowed in straight, they would be castigated by the group and eventually prodded into some sort of reaction that usually ended up in a lashing out in the group by the misbehavior, which resulted in their being restrained or sometimes taken to what was called a quiet room and maybe restrained in there for a while. Some kids would try to inflict harm on themselves, and the girls in particular who chose to misbehave would do things like cut into their skin with their fingernails. One of the most troubling aspects of this, of course, is that the kids themselves were the instigators of this violence against each other, and I myself am guilty of having committed violence against others while in the program. Of course, the ultimate way to rebel against the straight program was to find a way to escape, or cop out as they called it. And kids did this in a number of ways, ranging from in the middle of the night from the host home to running from their old comer in the parking lot before they made it to the building. And some kids even charged from the group past the person standing at one of the doors leading to the outside of the building. All newcomers would have to stand up at their first open meeting and talk over a microphone to the parents, and they were required to confess all the drugs they might have done, and also tell one of these scenarios from their past where they did drugs and got into some sort of trouble, and then express guilt and remorse and that kind of thing. And then once they had been in the program for a week or so, they could begin earning one of two privileges of first phase, and those were talk, which was a 10-minute sit-down meeting with their parents after the open meeting, accompanied by an old comer, or they could earn what was called TNR, and that stood for Talk and Responsibilities, which was the same as talk, but with the added privilege of being allowed to stand guard at one of the doors around the group room, and also being allowed to carry other newcomers around by the back of the pants inside the straight building. 14 days was the minimum requirement for time on first phase, but due to the draconian nature of the straight program, most people were on first phase for much longer than that, and a lot of kids were required to repeat the process until they had finally learned to exhibit the correct demeanor of total conformity to the straight program. This meant that, among other things, they would have to constantly express, often falsely, an appreciation and even love for the very people and totalitarian system oppressing them. It's one of the things that made straight so Orwellian, and you could really see the transition from a newcomer first in the program who was pretty much afraid of everything going on there to one who is submitted and realized that to make it through the phases of straight, they have to force others to go along with the program as well. If you weren't motivating in group, someone would nudge you or push your arms to try to get you to motivate. Or if you weren't looking directly at the person standing up in group talking, somebody would push your face towards the direction of that person. Or if you weren't sitting upright, somebody would ram their hand down your back to make you sit up and basically entice you into some sort of physical reaction that can only lead to violence unless the person just submits and goes along with every little thing that the program requires. And one of those things was writing the nightly moral inventory, or MI for short. And this was basically a summing up of the day's events and where that person stood or stagnated in the program. And this nightly ritual of writing the MI started on day one in the program and continued every night throughout the course of the program. And I think I'll wrap this segment up with a decent example of an actual moral inventory written by a kid who had been in the program just a couple of days, and I was his old comer when I was on fifth phase. And if you look closely at this MI, you can actually see an example of a newcomer expressing anger and the underlying desire to lash out at someone else in group.
Straight.